Welcome to my channel. Subscribe to the channel and listen to my stories every day. As I sat across from Clara at the dinner table, a flickering candle between us, the dim light threw shadows across her face, deepening the weariness in her eyes. I watched her, catching every nervous shift, every tremor in her hand as she gripped the stem of her wine glass. Tonight was supposed to be a normal night, just a quiet dinner between us. Yet, there was an electric tension in the air, an unspoken weight that seemed to fill the room. I wasn't sure how long we had been sitting there in silence, but I knew that whatever she was about to say, it wouldn't be good. "Jack," she finally began, her voice low and hesitant. "There's something I need to tell you." She avoided my eyes, looking down as she spoke. There was something rehearsed about the way she said it, as if she had practiced these words many times before, perhaps even with someone else. The anger that had been simmering inside me for weeks was clawing its way up again, burning in my chest. But I kept my face still, watching her. I wasn't going to let her off that easy. This wasn't the first time she'd been evasive, and I had spent too many nights piecing together her strange behavior. Late-night texts, whispered calls, and that panicked look she had when her phone buzzed, it was all falling into place. "You've been seeing someone else, haven't you?" I asked, my voice calm, even as I felt the ache of betrayal settle into my bones. Her eyes widened, and for a moment, I saw a flicker of guilt pass over her face, but she quickly looked down, avoiding my gaze as if that alone could wash away her wrongdoing. It's not like that, Jack," she whispered, the tremor in her voice betraying her. She twisted the stem of her glass, her fingers turning pale from the grip. "I just needed some space. A little excitement." Excitement. The word hung in the air, taunting me. I clenched my fists under the table, but kept my voice steady. "Excitement?" I repeated, watching as she squirmed, her face flushed with shame. She took a shaky sip of wine, as though it could help her drown her guilt. For a few moments, neither of us spoke. I was waiting for her to offer an apology, an explanation, something that could give me a reason to forgive her, but all I saw was a woman struggling to maintain the remnants of her pride. I could feel the gap between us widening, growing into an unbridgeable chasm filled with all the doubts and fears I had bottled up for weeks. The clues had been there, painting a picture that was impossible to ignore. First, it was the business trips, the mysterious late nights, and then, the so-called emergency dinners that always seemed to happen on weekends. The kicker was that night she came home, frantically grabbing her phone off the car seat, her face twisted with panic as if I'd caught her red-handed. That was when I decided to investigate. I couldn't just sit back and let her rewrite our story while I played the fool. My first instinct had been denial, convincing myself that maybe I was just being paranoid. But as the evidence piled up, denial had been replaced by a determination to know the truth. I looked through her messages, her emails, intimate, unapologetic exchanges between her and someone named Brian. Brian from accounting, she'd listed him in her phone. As if that would somehow make it less significant, less hurtful. Clara was still talking, her words blending together, trying to explain herself. She mentioned feeling neglected, needing connection, all those tired excuses that I'd read 100 times in betrayal stories but never thought would apply to me. My jaw clenched as she painted herself the victim, struggling through her own dissatisfaction. She didn't look at me once, probably hoping that if she didn't see the pain in my face, it would make it easier to tell her story. "I just felt disconnected, Jack. I felt like we were drifting apart." Her words were tentative, barely more than a whisper. It was like she was trying to justify her betrayal, to cast herself as the protagonist in some romantic tragedy where her needs went unfulfilled. And maybe, in some twisted way, she believed her own words. But I wasn't here to soothe her guilt or give her a way out. I was done with the excuses, done with watching her treat our marriage like an afterthought. I nodded slowly, more to myself than to her, piecing together my next move. I couldn't keep this up, couldn't pretend that this was something we could just talk through, like it was a minor rift that would heal with time. "Clara," I said, cutting off her rambling. She froze, her eyes finally meeting mine, her face pale in the candlelight. "How long?" The color drained from her cheeks, her mouth opening slightly before she looked down, her fingers nervously playing with her napkin. She didn't answer, and that was all the confirmation I needed. I felt a strange sense of calm settle over me, as if finally, the pieces had all fallen into place. She started talking again, spinning more apologies, saying things like, "It didn't mean anything," and "I never stopped loving you." But her words felt hollow, rehearsed. This was the moment where, in a different story, I might have yelled, might have thrown the wine glass across the room, letting rage consume me. But instead, I simply watched her, feeling as though I was seeing her for the first time. 2 days later, I set my plan in motion. Clara had left for work that morning with the same careful calm she'd shown at dinner. She acted as though we'd reached some sort of understanding, as though her hollow apologies had been enough to mend the fractures she'd caused. I let her believe it, playing my part, nodding along as she spoke about her schedule and her plans for the evening. The moment she left, I got to work. I packed her bags, leaving them by the door, a silent testament to the boundary I was drawing. The locks had been changed, and I left a note on the kitchen table. It was simple, just enough to make my intentions clear: you wanted excitement. Now you have it. Goodbye. When she returned, I knew she'd find that note, those bags, and the life she'd taken for granted. There would be no screaming, no final argument. Just silence, and the stark reality of her choices staring back at her. As I walked out the door, leaving the house behind, I felt an overwhelming sense of freedom. The man I had been, the man who had ignored the warning signs and clung to a fractured marriage, was gone. In his place was someone who had chosen himself over someone else's selfish need for excitement. And as I drove away, I realized that for the first time in months, I was at peace. The sound of my own footsteps echoed in the hallway as I headed toward my car, feeling the weight of finality in each step. I glanced back at the house, now just a shell of what it once meant to me. The rooms and hallways where I'd shared a life with Clara were filled with nothing but echoes, empty reminders of what I thought we'd built. It was surreal, almost like leaving behind a piece of myself. I paused by the driveway, gripping my car keys tightly, feeling the gravity of what I'd just done settle into my chest. Driving away, I felt a strange mix of relief and emptiness. The anger was gone now, replaced by a quiet, hollow peace. As I merged onto the freeway, I let the thoughts come. Clara's face at the dinner table, her voice as she tried to rationalize her betrayal, the way her gaze flickered with guilt, yet never once held remorse. I wondered how long she'd been planning her excuses, how many nights she'd rehearsed her lines. And as much as it sickened me, there was still a part of me that ached, that wanted answers I'd never receive. I didn't know where I was going, but I kept driving, following the city lights until they faded and I was on open road. The night sky stretched endlessly above, and for the first time in what felt like forever, I had no destination. No obligations, no promises to keep. Just silence. I finally pulled off at a gas station and parked under the fluorescent lights, trying to get my thoughts straight. As I sat there, the events of the past few days played over and over in my mind. It hadn't been easy pretending everything was normal after that dinner, especially when Clara had tried to play her usual role as if nothing had changed. She'd still filled the air with meaningless conversation, asking about my day, making plans for the weekend as if her infidelity was just a minor inconvenience, a hurdle we could somehow overcome. It was like she thought I'd accept her half-hearted apology, that I'd be grateful for her honesty. But honesty wasn't something you used to patch up a marriage after you'd already betrayed it. The day after that dinner, while she was at work, I'd taken a sick day, calling in and spending hours making preparations. It was a quiet, almost meditative process. I went through each room, taking down photos, clearing out her belongings, mentally sifting through memories like sorting through a cluttered attic. Some items I set aside to box up and donate, while others, things too personal, too painful, I tossed in the trash. A part of me felt like I was erasing her from my life, piece by piece, but another part felt as if I were reclaiming something I'd lost, something I hadn't even realized was slipping away. As I drove back to town that evening, I couldn't help but wonder how Clara was reacting to the sight of her bags by the door. The thought brought a faint smirk to my face, a grim satisfaction at the image of her surprise, maybe even a bit of panic. It was poetic in a way, giving her the exact dose of reality she'd so carelessly disregarded. She'd always been the type to talk about freedom, about wanting to feel alive, but now she'd see what it truly meant to be free from the life we'd built. The next morning, after a restless night in a cheap motel, I sat down with my coffee and opened my laptop, staring at the blank screen. I had never been one for public displays of emotion, but there was a part of me that wanted to document this moment, to put it out there, not for sympathy but maybe for closure. Against my better judgment, I opened up a document and started typing, letting the words flow without overthinking. I wrote about everything, the trust, the betrayal, the decision to walk away. As the words spilled out, I found a strange comfort in seeing it all on paper. It was like putting the final nail in a coffin. I spent the next few hours going through legal documents, starting the process of severing the last threads that still bound me to Clara. Divorce paperwork, asset division, the house, it was daunting, and a part of me wanted to just leave it all behind, to let her have it and walk away clean. But I knew that wasn't practical. I wasn't going to hand over years of hard work just because she couldn't stay faithful. If she wanted excitement, she could have it, but I'd be damned if she thought she could take what I'd built along with her. I was on my way to meet with a lawyer when my phone buzzed. Clara. I let it ring, watching as the call went to voicemail, a part of me morbidly curious about what she'd say. It rang again a few minutes later, then again. The persistence didn't surprise me, though it almost amused me. The woman who had spent the last few months pretending everything was fine was now desperate to speak, probably hoping for one last chance to explain herself, maybe even to negotiate. Against my better judgment, I listened to the voicemail. Her voice was soft, pleading, the confident tone she'd used at dinner replaced with something more desperate. Jack, please, let's talk. I didn't mean for things to get this far. I just want to explain myself. Her words trailed off, replaced by a shaky breath. Can we please, just meet me somewhere? I think you owe me that much. Owe her? The audacity of it almost made me laugh. She'd been the one to betray us, to let someone else into the life we'd built, yet she was now asking me for favors. As I replayed the message, part of me felt a bitter satisfaction, knowing that she was feeling the weight of her own actions. But another part of me, a quieter, tired part, wanted to be done with it all, to let go and never hear from her again. I ignored her call and continued on to the lawyer's office, feeling a sense of determination I hadn't felt in years. The meeting was straightforward, I didn't give more details than necessary, keeping it clinical. It felt strange to talk about my marriage in terms of assets, to reduce our life together to numbers and bullet points. But it was a necessary process, a final severing of ties, and I was ready to see it through. Over the next few days, Clara's messages continued, ranging from pleading to angry to confused. Each time, I read them, a part of me detached, like an outsider looking in. She cycled through apologies and rationalizations, the desperate attempts of someone who'd once thought they held the power to control every outcome. But now, as the truth stared her down, she was grasping for answers that didn't exist. One morning, as I sat drinking coffee, I received one last message from her. It was short, resigned, and for the first time, she didn't beg or try to explain. I understand, it read. You're right to be angry. I'm sorry for everything. And just like that, the chapter closed. I felt no triumph, no vindication, only a quiet emptiness, a sense of moving on. The woman I'd loved, the life we'd built together, had faded into a memory, and I was ready to let it rest in the past. As I packed up my things that day, ready to move into a new apartment across town, I took one last look around the house, at the walls we'd painted, the furniture we'd picked out together. I felt a pang of nostalgia, a lingering attachment to a life that had once felt so real, so grounded. But as I turned the key in the lock, I left behind not just a house, but a version of myself that no longer served me. Driving away, I felt lighter, as if a weight had been lifted. The open road stretched before me, promising new beginnings, new possibilities. And as I looked ahead, I realized I wasn't just leaving behind a broken marriage, I was reclaiming a future that was mine alone. The apartment was a small, modest place on the edge of the city, but it felt like a fresh start. I'd signed the lease without much thought, just relieved to have somewhere to go that wasn't tied to Clara. It was a world apart from the house we'd shared, no sprawling yard, no carefully chosen furniture or coordinated decor. Just four walls and a quiet solitude that felt like freedom. For the first time in years, I had silence. No late-night calls from Clara, no hurried apologies about staying late at work, no vague, half-hearted explanations. I had my own space, my own time, and for the first time, I could let myself unravel, no longer bound by the responsibility of keeping a life together. I started settling into routines, discovering the rhythm of living alone. There was a simplicity to it, an ease that I hadn't realized I'd been craving. Yet, in the quiet moments, the weight of it all still caught up to me. The anger had faded, replaced by something more difficult to face, a hollow feeling, as though a part of me was still back in that house, lingering in the life I'd left behind. I couldn't just bury it and pretend it didn't matter. Every once in a while, memories of Clara would slip through, uninvited. I'd be cooking, and suddenly I'd remember how we'd spent hours picking out our kitchenware, or I'd catch a scent that reminded me of her perfume. The past was still there, haunting me, like a ghost that had yet to be laid to rest. To cope, I buried myself in work, volunteering for extra hours, taking on new projects that left me too exhausted to think about anything else. My co-workers probably thought I was trying to climb the corporate ladder, but the truth was, I just didn't want to be alone with my thoughts. On the rare nights when I didn't stay late, I found myself wandering the city, taking in the sights and sounds of places I hadn't visited in years. There was a certain comfort in being surrounded by strangers, in the anonymity of the crowded streets where no one knew my story. One night, a couple of weeks into my new routine, I decided to grab a drink at a bar down the street from my apartment. It was a quiet place, dimly lit, with worn leather seats and a faint smell of wood polish that gave it a comforting, old-world feel. I took a seat at the bar, ordering a whiskey and letting the burn of it numb the edges of my thoughts. I was halfway through my second drink when I noticed her. She was sitting a few seats down, alone, swirling her wine in the glass with an absent look in her eyes. She didn't notice me, too lost in her own thoughts, and something about her expression struck a chord. She looked lonely. Not the kind of loneliness that comes from solitude, but the kind that comes from carrying something heavy, something unspoken. I knew that look because I'd seen it in my own reflection. Against my better judgment, I nodded in her direction, offering a tentative smile. She noticed, looked back at me, and after a moment, returned the gesture. It wasn't much, just a brief connection between two strangers, but it felt good, normal, almost. We ended up chatting, and as we talked, I realized I hadn't laughed like this in months. I hadn't felt this sense of ease, this ability to just be myself, without the weight of betrayal shadowing every word. Her name was Rachel, a teacher, recently moved to the city after her own breakup. She didn't share much, and I didn't pry. It was enough to know that she understood, that we were two people finding solace in each other's company, if only for a night. We spent hours talking, laughing, letting the conversation drift from light-hearted jokes to confessions we hadn't intended to share. She didn't ask about my past, didn't press for details, and I was grateful for it. By the end of the night, we'd exchanged numbers, though I wasn't sure if I'd ever reach out. The encounter had been enough, a reminder that life went on, that there were still people out there who didn't carry the weight of my history, who could see me without the shadow of Clara's betrayal lingering over me. In the weeks that followed, I focused on moving forward. I took up jogging in the mornings, finding a strange peace in the steady rhythm of my feet hitting the pavement. I started cooking again, something I hadn't done since I left the house. At first, it felt strange, cooking for one, but over time, it became a ritual, a small act of self-care that reminded me I was building something new, even if it was just for myself. I hadn't planned on calling Rachel, but one rainy evening, after a long day at work, I found myself staring at her number, wondering if she'd even remember me. On a whim, I dialed, half expecting it to go to voicemail. But she picked up on the second ring, her voice warm, familiar. We talked for a while, the conversation easy, unforced. She suggested meeting up again, and I agreed, surprising myself with how much I wanted to see her. We met for coffee, then dinner a few days later. Each time, the connection between us grew, though we kept it light, unspoken. There was a quiet understanding between us that neither of us wanted anything complicated, anything that would bring back the past. Rachel had her own ghosts, and I had mine, and we respected that boundary, finding comfort in simply being together. Over time, though, I realized something unsettling. I was starting to care. It was a quiet feeling, creeping up on me without warning, and part of me wanted to push it away, to keep her at a safe distance. I'd been burned before, had seen what happened when you gave too much of yourself. But the more time I spent with Rachel, the more I found myself letting down the walls I'd so carefully built. One night, as we were sitting in a small restaurant by the water, watching the city lights reflect off the waves, Rachel turned to me, her expression soft, searching. "Jack," she began, hesitating. "Why did you leave your marriage?" The question hung between us, heavy, laced with an understanding that she wasn't asking to judge but to know. I took a breath, feeling the old ache rise up, but this time, it was softer, less jagged. I told her everything, the late nights, the lies, the betrayal that had shattered the life I'd thought was unbreakable. I expected her to react, to offer sympathy or advice, but she simply listened, her gaze steady, supportive. When I finished, she reached across the table, placing her hand over mine, a quiet gesture of comfort that said more than words ever could. For the first time, I felt a flicker of hope, a sense that maybe, just maybe, I could let someone in again. Rachel didn't ask for details, didn't press for more than I was willing to give, and in that moment, I knew I'd found something rare, someone who saw me not as a man scarred by the past but as someone capable of moving forward. We left the restaurant, walking side by side along the waterfront, the cool breeze carrying away the last remnants of pain that had clung to me for so long. For the first time in what felt like forever, I felt alive, as though I'd shed the weight of Clara's betrayal, left it behind in the dim glow of the city lights. That night, as I lay in bed, staring up at the ceiling, I felt a strange calm settle over me. It wasn't that the hurt was gone, it never would be, not entirely. But it had shifted, softened, replaced by a quiet resilience, a sense that I could face whatever came next without the shadow of my past defining me. I knew I'd carry scars, that they'd be a part of me, a reminder of what I'd endured. But for the first time, they didn't feel like a burden. They felt like something I could bear, a part of my story that didn't have to hold me back. And as I drifted off to sleep, I felt a deep, unshakable peace, an acceptance of what had been and a quiet resolve for what was yet to come. In the months that followed, Rachel became a steady presence in my life. We spent evenings together, sometimes lost in conversation, other times just sharing a comfortable silence. She had her own scars, her own past that she only hinted at, and I respected her quiet boundaries, just as she respected mine. I'd been cautious, hesitant even, but over time, I'd found myself softening, letting go of the constant need to guard my heart. With Rachel, I felt something I hadn't in a long time, hope. The possibility of building something new. One chilly afternoon in early winter, we decided to take a drive out of the city to a small town by the coast. Rachel had mentioned a cafe there she loved, a place she'd go when she needed to escape the noise of the city. I liked the idea of seeing this part of her world, of stepping into a place that had been hers alone. She drove, her laughter filling the car as she told stories of her travels, her hand occasionally reaching over to squeeze mine. As we pulled into town, the air was crisp, the wind carrying the scent of saltwater. Rachel pointed out the landmarks with an excited glimmer in her eyes, sharing small anecdotes about her favorite spots. The cafe was just as she described, cozy, with warm wooden interiors, and an impressive view of the ocean that stretched endlessly before us. We sat by the window, sipping coffee, watching the waves crash against the rocks in rhythmic, steady pulses. At some point, Rachel grew quiet, her gaze lost in the horizon, as if contemplating something heavy. I waited, sensing that whatever it was, she needed to approach it in her own time. After a long pause, she turned to me, her eyes soft but resolute. "Jack," she began, her voice barely a whisper. "There's something I haven't told you. Something I should have said a long time ago." A cold knot tightened in my stomach, but I kept my face steady, nodding for her to continue. She looked down at her hands, twisting a silver ring around her finger, as though finding the words was a battle within herself. "When we met, I was still trying to move on from someone." Her voice trembled slightly, and she glanced at me, her eyes filled with a sorrow I couldn't quite understand. "It wasn't a breakup, exactly. He passed away." I felt a pang of empathy, a weight in my chest for her grief, for the loss she must have carried alone. But something about her words, her tone, suggested there was more. "He was my husband, Jack," she continued, her voice wavering. "I lost him 2 years ago in an accident." The shock hit me like a wave, and I struggled to absorb her words. She had never mentioned marriage, never once hinted at a life with someone else. It was as though she'd kept an entire world hidden from me, one that she could never fully leave behind. "Rachel," I stammered, unsure of what to say. I wanted to comfort her, to understand, but the revelation had cracked something in me, a fissure that seemed to widen with each passing second. "I thought I was ready to move on," she whispered, her gaze fixed on the table. "I thought I could build something new with you, to finally let myself feel again. But I was wrong." The words hung in the air, each one a cold, heavy stone. A chill settled over me, and I felt a sense of dread, an unspoken conclusion forming that I didn't want to acknowledge. "Jack," she continued, finally meeting my eyes, her expression pained. "I care about you so much. But this, whatever we have, I can't keep pretending it's fair to you. Because my heart is still with him." The finality in her voice left no room for argument. I could see the resolve in her eyes, the quiet acceptance of her own limitations. She tried to let go, to move forward, but the grief had stayed with her, an anchor that kept pulling her back to a life she'd once known. For a moment, I wanted to reach out, to tell her that we could work through it, that I'd wait, that I'd do whatever it took. But as I looked at her, I saw the truth in her expression, the love she'd once felt for someone else, a love that time hadn't been able to erase. We sat in silence, the sound of the waves filling the void between us. I couldn't bring myself to speak, to ask for more than she could give. The part of me that had once been betrayed, that had learned to guard itself against hurt, was now faced with a different kind of pain, one that came not from anger or deceit but from the quiet, irrevocable reality of loss. Rachel reached across the table, placing her hand over mine. Her touch was warm, gentle, a silent apology for the heartbreak she hadn't intended. "I'm so sorry, Jack," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "I wanted to love you the way you deserve, but I don't think I can." I nodded, swallowing the lump in my throat, feeling the hollow ache of another ending I hadn't anticipated. There was nothing left to say. We sat there, both of us mourning different kinds of love, both of us trapped in memories that we couldn't leave behind. When we finally stood to leave, Rachel wrapped her arms around me, holding me close in a bittersweet embrace. It felt like a goodbye, one that neither of us wanted but both understood was necessary. As we parted, she offered me a sad smile, a silent thank you for what we'd shared, however brief it had been. I drove back alone, the night settling around me like a heavy blanket, the road stretching endlessly into the dark. The emptiness I'd thought I'd escaped returned, a reminder that sometimes, moving on was not as simple as finding someone new. Sometimes, the scars ran deeper, binding you to a past you could never truly let go. Back in my empty apartment, I sat on the edge of my bed, the weight of the silence pressing down on me. I realized that I had come full circle, facing yet another loss, another chapter closed before it had a chance to truly begin. And as I stared into the dark, the last traces of hope fading, I understood that perhaps some endings were not meant to bring new beginnings. Some endings were simply that, an end, with nothing left to follow.